Chapter 1. The Day the Sky Opened. No one on Earth agreed afterward on what the first hour felt like. Some said it felt like history ending. Others said it felt like every old fear humans had ever carried crawling out of story and finally deciding to become practical. In military archives, the beginning of the invasion is marked with exact timestamps, orbital vectors, casualty curves, and threat designations. But those clean records never quite capture the emotional violence of the moment when the sky over a living world stops belonging to weather and starts belonging to war. At 8:14 Universal Time Coordinated, telescopes from Chile to India to the dark side stations around Luna began registering impossible thermal blooms beyond geosynchronous orbit. At 8:17, civilian satellites disappeared by the dozen. At 8:19, every long-range defense network on Earth confirmed the same impossible fact. A foreign fleet, massive enough to darken portions of orbital tracking with sheer density, had arrived under folded space insertion with no detectable precursor wave. It was not a scouting force. It was not an embassy protected by ugly escorts. It was an army in the oldest and most terrifying sense of the word, one built to land, seize, kill, and remain. 3 minutes later, before world leaders had even finished the first round of denial and confirmation, the invaders began their descent. They came in towers of fire. The first wave was not ships in the cinematic sense. It was drop architecture, armored descent cylinders by the hundreds of thousands, each one burning through the upper atmosphere under controlled braking fields, each one large enough to hold platoons or warframes or supply organisms no human doctrine had names for. From the ground it looked as though the sky itself had cracked and was shedding molten teeth. People in cities filmed them. People in rural areas stared with mouths open beside tractors, fuel pumps, and school bus stops. Pilots reported meteor storms with formation discipline. Religious feeds across several continents exploded with apocalyptic interpretations before communications ministries even finished drafting neutral language. Then the first impacts came, and neutrality died where it stood. The invaders had not chosen one grand capital or one symbolic military target. They struck everywhere that mattered in parallel deserts, plains, coastlines, forests, industrial belts, transport corridors, island chains, agricultural interior, mountain passes, old Air Force ranges, civilian ports. It was the sort of landing pattern only possible for a species that had studied a world clinically enough to understand that civilization survives through networks, not monuments. Earth, in those first terrible minutes, learned that its enemy was not merely strong. It was intelligent in the cold, predatory way that assumes every life-supporting system is just another artery to be cut. The alien species later came to be known as the Karen Ascendancy. Though on the first day, humans knew them only through scattered visual fragments and battlefield panic. They were larger than humans on average, built in dense asymmetrical lines like something evolution had sharpened for crush-range combat before technology elevated the same instincts into empire. Their armor looked grown rather than manufactured black gold carapace plating that flowed around joints and thickened under fire, layered over bodies with too many old scars visible wherever the plating parted. Their helmets were faceless except for horizontal crimson slits that brightened when they acquired targets. They did not shout while landing. They did not broadcast demands. They came down, opened their drop shells, and began killing with disciplined silence. In dozens of places, the first human defenders police tactical units, local military garrisons, reserve brigades, terrified security personnel, at infrastructure nodes made the mistake of expecting negotiation windows. The Karen answered hails with artillery bursts. They cut apart barricades with directed plasma. They advanced through screaming roads and burning rail yards like something already convinced of its right to inherit the planet. Within 6 hours, human casualties had crossed the first 100,000. Within 12, entire governments were operating from relocation bunkers and airborne command webs. Within a day, the rough estimate of enemy ground presence had reached the number that made experienced generals across Earth stare at their maps in sickened disbelief. 1 million. A million alien soldiers on the ground. No one says that number out loud casually when they understand what it means. 1 million is not an invasion fleet. It is not a punitive expedition. It is not a raid, a demonstration, or even merely a war. A million is colonization through violence. A million is confidence, so absolute it borders on theological. The Karen had not arrived thinking Earth might be hard. They had arrived assuming Earth would break on schedule. Humanity reacted with more coherence than the invaders expected, but less than later patriotic retellings pretend. There was bravery everywhere, yes, but also confusion, fragmentation, and terrible improvisation. Fighter wings launched into skies that no longer belonged to them and vanished under orbital fire. Coastal defense batteries knocked enemy drop towers from the air, only to be overrun from behind by units already landed hours earlier. Civilian convoys jammed highways and made themselves perfect targets until military police and local volunteers began forcing traffic into rural spread patterns under fire. Parliaments and assemblies issued calls for unity. Some were eloquent. Some were frightened. Some were cut short mid-sentence when the buildings housing them ceased to exist. The old alliances held mostly. The old grudges briefly died. In one now famous emergency exchange, a naval commander from a nation that had spent decades politically at odds with half its neighbors said, "We can litigate history if we survive." No one argued. For the first 3 days, the human response was survival in its purest form: delay, hide, scatter, regroup, preserve command continuity, save as many civilians as possible, and for the love of every god ever invented, keep enough weapons alive to make the planet expensive. What the Karen did not understand, not yet, was that humans had spent thousands of years telling stories about the end of the world and teaching one another how to build while expecting fire. Earth was not politically unified enough to make peace simple, but it was culturally saturated with disaster memory. Floods, wars, plagues, collapse, blackouts, evacuation, bunkers, reserve protocols, amateur radio, local militias, redundant grids, volunteer logistics, civilian engineering under pressure. The invaders had studied the planet's armies and arsenals. They had not fully understood the depth of its stubbornness. City by city and valley by valley, humanity refused to die according to plan. Small airports became drone nests. Shipping ports became artillery mazes. Farmers buried fuel caches in machine sheds and marked them only in family code. Train conductors rerouted military equipment through civilian freight under blackout conditions. Programmers volunteered cyber defenses from basements while older veterans ran neighborhood survival grids. Nurses worked under shattered ceilings. Firefighters drove through plasma fall to reach hospitals. Children were hidden in subways and mountain tunnels while parents went back above ground to hold doors no one had designed to stop an interstellar army. Still, by the end of the second week, the map looked hopeless. The Karen controlled broad ground across 6 continents. Their orbital fleet remained dominant. Their atmospheric carriers were seeding supply growth nodes and hardened command towers into Earth's living skin. Some analysts began privately preparing for long occupation scenarios, resistance models measured in decades instead of months, the kind of brutal arithmetic that asks which parts of a civilization can survive under enemy rule, even if its flags cannot. 1 million soldiers was too much. Too much mass, too much armor, too much confidence, too much industry behind them. Every historical analogy humans reached for failed under the scale. There had never been anything like this. Never one enemy host so large, so alien, so committed to breaking a world at its foundations. Then, on day 17, the first Karen Field Army entered the Carpathian Kill Basin and ceased reporting in under 34 minutes. At first, even Human Command thought it was a communication blackout event. Then drone feeds arrived. Then recon satellites adjusted. Then survivors from nearby villages began telling stories too unbelievable for exhausted officers to dismiss. Entire armored formations swallowed by engineered mud and collapsed roadbeds. Supply columns detonated from below where old mining networks had been turned into fuel traps. Artillery coordinates appearing in impossible speed because local shepherds, hikers, and forestry crews had become battlefield eyes. Bridges cut only after full enemy weight committed. Ambushes layered behind ambushes. False withdrawals. Buried lances. Railgun hits from mountain shadows. Human infantry moving at night through weather the Karen had judged tactically irrelevant. Wolves on the ridges. Drones in the clouds. Mortars in the churches. The First Field Army did not exactly vanish. That would have been cleaner. It was dismantled, digested, and erased so thoroughly by terrain, engineering, and patient hatred that by dawn there was no coherent force left to extract. The Karen sent a second army into another mountain corridor 40 hours later. It did not return either. Only then did the invaders begin to understand that landing 1,000,000 soldiers on Earth might prove easier than getting even one of them home. Chapter 2. The Planet That Refused to Stay Conquered. The Karen were not fools. That fact made what happened next more impressive, not less. A stupid invader can be lured, mocked, and butchered once or twice before its collapse becomes inevitable. A disciplined invader learns. It catalogs failure, revises doctrine, adjusts expectations, and uses brute scale to iron surprise out of the enemy. That was what made the ascendancy terrifying on every world it had already consumed. They did not merely possess numbers and hardware. They possessed the cultural patience to turn setbacks into education and education into more efficient killing. After the annihilation of their first 2 interior field armies, they did not rage blindly into more trap corridors. They paused. Orbital overwatch intensified. Atmospheric scanners were recalibrated for hidden tunnel networks, irregular heat bloom, and local biosignature clustering. Human-controlled roads were abandoned in favor of land-clearing operations. Villages near resistance zones were emptied with deliberate cruelty, not because the Karen needed revenge, but because they correctly understood that Earth's local civilian knowledge had become a strategic weapon. If one wanted to break the human style of war, one had to separate humans from the ground they had learned like prayer. That calculation came too late. By the 3rd week, Earth's militaries had stopped trying to defend the planet as if it were a conventional front and begun defending it as if it were a labyrinth designed by 10,000 ancestors with a grudge. Unified World Command fragile, improvised, and surprisingly effective divided the occupied zones into consumption theaters, not because the name was poetic, but because that was the operational goal. No Karen unit was to remain merely engaged. It was to be consumed, cut from supply, denied rest, mapped, misled, bled, swarmed, buried, burned, frozen, flooded, terrified. The human understanding of war became ecosystemic. They no longer asked only where the enemy was strongest. They asked where the enemy moved badly, where it trusted its own armor too much, where it assumed technology had rendered older forms of hardship obsolete, where climate could be turned from nuisance into executioner, and where civilians knew the land in ways no satellite ever would. The answer, again and again, was almost everywhere. Europe became the school of deliberate ruin. The Karen had hoped the continent's dense infrastructure and short-range mobility would give them control through rapid node seizure. Instead, they inherited a map full of medieval city bones, mountain weather, river choke points, tunnel systems, old fortifications, industrial ruins, and civilian populations with enough historical memory to understand that occupation is fought as much through stubborn inconvenience as through glorious battle. Human defenders detonated tunnels only after enemy armor entered. Flood controls turned valleys into armor graves. Rail lines became long-range supply bait, then explosive cages. Alpine weather stations fed targeting data to artillery hidden in old avalanche shelters. In the Balkans and Carpathians, local resistance units working with regular forces transformed every ridge road into a test of nerves and every abandoned village into a question the invaders answered incorrectly at lethal cost. Karen Command began referring to the region as the continent of false emptiness, because every place that looked evacuated turned out to contain mines, signals, snipers, or enough old civilian spite to matter. North America, by contrast, became a war of impossible depth. The invaders landed heavy in the interior because they assumed, correctly, that the industrial and agricultural heartlands mattered, and incorrectly that broad open spaces were easier to pacify than old dense terrain. The first month proved them disastrously wrong. Human defenders withdrew faster in some regions than Patriot songs later admitted, but the retreat was not surrender. It was invitation. Karen columns pushing through prairie logistics belts found grain silos rigged into firestorms, culverts buried under anti-armor spears, and county roads feeding them toward range kill zones that local National Guards, hunters, ranchers, tribal scouts, and regular army batteries had prepared together under blackout. In the mountain west, armored formations vanished into weather and elevation because humans destroyed the easy passes and left only the ones that looked possible. In the forests, old logging paths became one-way corridors into hunter country. The Karen, bred for dominance through direct tactical superiority, despised war that forced them to fear emptiness. Humans gave them emptiness everywhere. 1,000 kilometers could look open and still be lethal from the ditch line inward. Africa and South America taught the invaders a different lesson, that terrain does not need to be urbanized to become strategic genius. In the Sahel and equatorial zones, the Karen learned what heat does to overconfident armor when local forces own the wells, the tracks, the shade, and the timings. They learned what happens when rivers are allowed to move, when burned grass reopens ancient migration channels, and when everyone in a village older than your empire knows exactly which wash, ridge, and thorn corridor your machines will choose if pressured from the east. In the Amazon, the war ceased making sense to them almost entirely. Great sensors, smart guns, advanced armor, all of it meant less in a place where line of sight was measured in leaves. Fungus ruined maintenance cycles, insects punished sleep, and humans moved with local guides through layers of green the invaders never stopped underestimating. Karen recovery teams sent into the basin often came back with less information than fear. They could report casualties. They could report heat, humidity, and unexplained disappearances. But they could not describe the enemy in a way command liked, because the enemy there was not a single force. It was humans, forest, water, sickness, patience, and the permanent sensation of being watched by something that had no interest in fighting fair, because fairness was a luxury for species not under invasion. Then came the sea. The Karen had assumed maritime control would be easy once orbital dominance was established. Earth's navies had suffered severe early losses, and the invaders' atmospheric carriers could range widely enough to make open ocean seem like a grave for anything too slow to hide beneath it. But humans had not spent centuries turning the sea into a strategic obsession merely to surrender it to one wave of superior technology. Submarines disappeared from official maps and reappeared beneath Karen logistics webs in places thought impossible. Fishing fleets became scouts. Container ships became decoys. Entire wreck yards were towed into key currents as trap clutter. Coastal children, in one now famous intelligence anecdote, identified 3 disguised Karen survey buoys before military analysts did because the local tide and bird behavior looked wrong. This is the sort of thing empires never understand until they are dying. A world is not truly conquerable if enough ordinary people can still notice when it feels different. The first months bled the Karen. The second broke their confidence. But it was the third that doomed them, because the million who had landed were not being replaced fast enough. Earth's orbital resistance, which had seemed doomed in the opening phase, adapted with the same maddening tenacity as the ground war. Improvised launch systems, hidden anti-orbital rails, reactivated moonside assets, and civilian industry converted to war fabrication began eating into the invasion fleet's ability to reinforce. The Karen still held the skies in many regions, but no longer cleanly, and every convoy from orbit to ground risked interception. 1 million soldiers had landed, yes, but once on the surface, they began to discover a terrible arithmetic. Occupation consumes men faster than invasion, and Earth was making every kilometer of territory cost blood twice once to take, once to keep. Meanwhile, the humans had millions more of their own, and worse from the Karen perspective, the humans did not need every civilian to fight with a rifle for the war to become unwinnable. They needed mechanics, weather observers, amateur coders, medics, linguists, drone hobbyists, truckers, cave guides, sewer engineers, mountain rescue teams, nurses, electricians, and old women who knew which roads turned to death after rain. Earth's resistance was not a single army. It was a civilization behaving like tissue around a splinter and refusing to stop inflaming. By month 5, entire Karen regiments were being written into human planning tables not as active threats, but as pending isolation groups. Their fate was assumed. They were surrounded by populations who hated them, cut off from reliable reinforcement, dependent on routes already compromised, and operating on a planet whose every season became another weapon. In Siberia, winter swallowed an armored thrust that had been designed by officers who laughed at weather as a pre-industrial concern. In the deserts, fuel columns died under heat and dust because humans understood that engines are just another kind of thirsty animal. In the flooded South Asian lowlands, amphibious infantry dissolved under disease, mud, and endless local interdiction. In city ruins from Sao Paulo to Lagos to Jakarta to old European industrial belts, the Karen won streets and lost districts and won districts and lost sleep until no tactical map meant anything beyond the next hour of fear. The million had landed. But they had landed on a world whose species had spent all of recorded history being told, in one way or another, that things stronger than them existed. Humans had not survived that lesson by being noble. They had survived it by becoming very hard to finish. Chapter 3. No Way Back to the Sky. The first time a Karen High Commander used the phrase surface entrapment cascade, it was not meant for public morale channels. It appeared in a sealed strategic memo routed from Ground Theater South to the Orbital War Council above the Atlantic debris band. And in typical military fashion, it tried to make catastrophe sound technical enough to remain manageable. The situation, the memo stated, was no longer best understood as active conquest with delayed pacification. It should instead be viewed as progressive surface entrapment of expeditionary mass under intensifying hostile planetary adaptation. In simpler language, the million soldiers who had landed were discovering they could not leave even when they won. Landing zones became death zones under artillery and partisan swarms. Extraction corridors were mapped and mined within hours. Atmospheric carriers descending for heavy lift came under fires from hidden launchers, portable rail systems, and aircraft so improvised they offended Karen aesthetics even while killing them. Earth was not just fighting the invasion. It was closing the trap above it. This realization spread slowly and then all at once. Soldiers at the sharp end had known it earlier, of course, because frontline troops always recognize doom before headquarters learns its proper terminology. They knew when evacuation requests stopped being answered with times and began being answered with probabilities. They knew when wounded comrades were told to hold one more night in territories no sane medic would call recoverable. They knew when the sky, once a promise of reinforcements, became merely another direction from which things might explode before help arrived. But empires do not permit that truth to travel upward cleanly. They clot it with doctrine, hope, punishment, and selective reporting. The Karen War State was no different. It took 6 full months and the destruction of 3 major orbital logistics spines before the command strata truly accepted that Earth was no longer a campaign. It was a grinder designed to turn invasion mass into isolated legends of horror, none of which could be assembled back into victory. By then the humans had begun their counterfall. The name came from media first, then military briefing shorthand, then eventually the official record, which always likes pretending it invents what frightened soldiers already know. Counterfall was not one offensive. It was the planetary moment when humanity stopped asking how long it could endure occupation and started calculating how to erase it district by district. There were no giant parades. No single impossible fleet charge. The war's romance, if anyone wanted to call it that, was distributed in ugly practical increments. Orbital denial guns hidden in mountain caverns began firing in coordinated windows so precise that Karen carriers had to hold higher, making drops slower and easier to intercept. Rail networks and maglev skeletons, which the invaders had repeatedly bombed, came back in patchwork forms under camouflage because human engineers are pathological about repairing what should stay dead. Drone swarms multiplied. Cyberwar cells learned Karen battlefield language faster than expected and began making their own command systems hallucinate threats in the rear. Food chains stabilized behind the front. Ammunition flow improved. Local militias that had started the war as frightened neighbors with scavenged weapons hardened into territorial killers who understood their ground better than any off-world tactician ever could. One by one, regions ceased being occupied territory and became liquidation theaters. The Karen tried to concentrate their surviving strength into continental fortresses. This was sensible by normal military logic. Scattered units die. Massed units can still strike, bargain, or at least be extracted if the sky's clear. But concentration on Earth meant presenting humans with what they wanted most, certainty. 1,000,000 soldiers had once been too many to think about in one image. By the 7th month, Earth's war planners were slicing that number into bags, pockets, cauldrons, and strongholds, each with estimated bleed rates and kill geometries. The invaders became countable. Countable meant solvable. Solvable meant doomed. Fortress belts in the American interior fell to layered siege and water denial. A Central Asian armored basin, protected for weeks by surviving Karen anti-air, collapsed after local resistance cells poisoned fuel pipelines with abrasive compounds and forced engines into self-killing failures. A coastal megacity zone in North Africa was retaken not by glorious direct assault, but by sewer infiltration, seawall breach, and a 6-day blackout that turned alien night optics into a liability when local fighters knew every stairwell by memory. None of it looked noble from overhead. All of it was final. For the invaders, the worst theaters were often the ones where nothing happened for too long. There is a unique terror in waiting on a hostile planet when every living thing and every weather pattern might be collaborating with a species that hates you. Karen survivors from late war interrogations all described the same psychological unraveling. The nights became unbearable first. Too many sounds. Too many false alarms. Too many shapes moving where sensors said there should be none. Then came the maintenance failures, small at first, then multiplying. Filters clogging with local spores. Power couplings fouled by insect resin and fine dust. Water turning suspect. Food stores tainted. Sleep broken by artillery that fired exactly once and then never again from that position. Human voices on stolen channels. Children's songs broadcast through abandoned speaker systems in cities the invaders had emptied, just to remind them who the ground still belonged to. After that, every shadow gained intent. Every silence became bait. Every human tactic worked twice because the first effect was physical and the second psychological. By the time frontline Karen units asked not for reinforcements, but for terrain certainty restoration, even their own command knew what that meant. The soldiers no longer believed reality around them was stable. Earth's wildlife, weather, and geology never stopped helping either. Late war makes all allies strange. A Karen bunker line in the Pacific Northwest flooded not because humans hit the dam directly, but because an atmospheric river event tracked perfectly by civilian meteorologists now integrated into War Command was exploited with timed demolition to turn a valley floor into a mud coffin. A retreat corridor in South America vanished under landslide once logging scars, burn zones, and bombardment-weakened hillsides met the first proper seasonal rains. In East Africa, a surviving alien brigade attempted nocturnal movement around what it thought was a quiet animal migration basin and instead triggered a panic cascade among thousands of massive herbivores under drone harassment and mortar light. The survivors of that disaster later refused orders involving open brushland under any circumstance. Human generals did not gloat about these things in official dispatches. Frontline troops did enough of that already. The phrase "none returned" began as a rumor. It emerged in border chatter after the destruction of the 9th Karen Extraction Legion in northern India, then appeared again after the Alpine purges, then after the Mississippi Basin collapses, and finally after the annihilation of the Pacific Redoubt, the last major organized attempt by the Karen to carve out a defendable corridor to the sea for mass evacuation. No one came out, soldiers would say. Not one returned. At first it meant units, then sectors, then whole landing groups. By the time the final month of the war opened, it had attached itself to the original invasion number with a force no propaganda office could have manufactured. 1,000,000 alien soldiers had landed. Not one returned. Strictly speaking, a tiny number were captured alive before the end. But no Karen combatant who came to Earth ever made it back to their empire as a free soldier. The survivors either died in prison years later, broken and old in ways their species had no cultural language for, or remained in sealed human black sites as strategic fossils from a war their government spent the next century pretending had never been winnable. The final organized Karen command on Earth fell in Patagonia. It chose the far south because the terrain looked hard, wide, cold, and less politically dense than the ruined population cores farther north. Hard terrain has tempted doomed armies since before humanity built cities. Hard terrain feels honest. It feels like if you can suffer enough, perhaps the world will respect the effort. But Patagonia, like Earth generally, respected nothing except adaptation. The Karen dug into wind-carved plateaus, old research bunkers, and cliffside launch cradles facing the southern sea, hoping to hold until one surviving orbital spire could punch a corridor open for extraction. Human command let them hope just long enough to fix the coordinates. Then came storm, bombardment, sabotage, blackout, landslide, close assault, and the long final collapse of a force too exhausted to understand which disaster belonged to humans and which belonged to the planet. By dawn of the last day, the invaders had no unified channel left. By noon, no artillery. By dusk, no command. When the final battlefield sweep reports came in, even hardened human officers sat quiet over them for a while. 1,000,000 alien soldiers had landed. Not one returned. The sentence looked too large to be true. Too mythic. Too clean for a war that had been so dirty in every practical sense. Yet there it was in the arithmetic, paid for by cities and farms and trenches and mass graves and old bridges and young dead and civilizations learning under maximum pressure what they had always been capable of. Earth had not simply survived the largest ground invasion in history. It had digested it. And somewhere far above, in the ruined orbit where the remnants of the Karen fleet were already retreating into the dark with what was left of their pride, the galaxy began to understand that landing on Earth had not been a military operation. It had been a mass burial with terrible scheduling. Chapter 4. What the galaxy called Earth afterward. The war did not end when the last Karen soldier died. That is one of history's least romantic truths. Wars end on paper later than they end in blood, and in memory later still. Earth spent years afterward lifting bodies from collapsed transit tunnels, draining armored swamps, reopening poisoned water systems, rebuilding cities whose maps no longer matched the ground, and teaching children how to sleep through weather again after too many months of associating thunder with bombardment. Millions of civilians had died. Tens of millions were displaced. Entire coastlines were scarred by kinetic strikes and downed fleet debris. The air over some old battlefield zones carried metallic flavors for years. Forests regrew around wreckage that new generations later mistook for geology. In places where the invaders had landed hardest, people planted memorial orchards because stone felt too cold and steel too much like the enemy. Human victory, if that was the word, never looked simple from the inside. It looked like reconstruction, grief rituals, prosthetics, archives, forensic teams, reburials, public trials for collaborators, and 1,000 ordinary acts of continuation. Humanity did what it always does after surviving catastrophe. It turned survival into labor. The galaxy, however, had its own way of metabolizing what happened. At first there was disbelief, then strategic horror, then the kind of fascinated respect normally reserved for natural disasters, black holes, or saints no one wants to live near. Many powers had expected Earth to die noisily. Some had expected it to survive partially under occupation, perhaps as a resistance theater or martyr civilization. Almost none had imagined that an interstellar empire could land 1,000,000 ground troops on the planet and lose every single one of them. Analysts spent decades breaking down the campaign, trying to determine where the Karen had truly failed. Some emphasized the invaders' initial underestimation of decentralized human resilience. Others pointed to orbital overreach, poor biospheric adaptation, contempt for local civilian knowledge, and the fatal decision to pursue total control instead of selective coercion. But the deepest lesson, repeated in every serious war college from the inner systems to the free belts, was simpler and more terrifying. Earth had turned being invaded into the enemy's terminal environment. That changed diplomacy forever. Before the war, many species had considered humanity impressive but volatile, cooperative but not central, emotionally intense in ways sometimes admired and sometimes regarded as strategically immature. After the war, Earth acquired a new set of names, none of them chosen by humans. Graveworld, the Million Tombs, the Closed-Mouth Planet, the world that eats armies. Some names were respectful, some fearful, some vulgar in the way soldiers make language kneel to memory. Frontier smugglers stopped calling Earth a death world, because that term suddenly felt too general, too harmless. Death worlds are places where life is dangerous. Earth, they said, was something else, a world where danger had learned logistics. In civilian sectors the mythology grew fast and weird. as it always does around survival too vast for ordinary scale. Parents on quiet colony moons warned children not to boast too much or they would sound like a Karen planning committee. Freight captains used million-drop thinking as shorthand for suicidal overconfidence. The phrase "not one return" became a proverb in half the trade languages for decisions so catastrophically arrogant that even mentioning them invited social embarrassment. Humanity itself did not celebrate the line much. There were victory days, yes. There were memorial flyovers, national and global addresses, medals, remembrances, and the inevitable flood of books, films, songs, arguments, and public myth-making. But the actual survivors of the landings tended to go quiet whenever outsiders recited the famous number with too much delight. They had seen what it cost. They knew that the million dead aliens on Earth had been paid for in schools full of children incinerated under orbital strikes, in medics worked until collapse, in fathers who never came home from local militia lines, in mothers who held highway barricades with anti-armor launchers because there was nowhere else left to stand, in farmers who turned their own fields into fire traps and then had to live afterward knowing where the bodies were beneath the wheat. The sentence "not one return" sounded powerful from a distance. Up close it sounded like grave dirt. Still, the strategic consequences remained. No major power ever again made casual plans about Earth. Not because humans became the strongest species in raw fleet terms overnight, they did not, but because everyone understood something that numbers alone could not express. To invade Earth was not merely to fight human militaries. It was to fight a civilization whose civilian body had already once converted itself into a planetary immune response. It was to fight on a world whose ecosystems, infrastructure habits, weather traditions, and cultural memory all bent under pressure towards stubborn violence. It was to risk becoming the next empire studied by school children as an example of fatal contempt. Several expansionist blocs quietly revised their long-range doctrine to include a category once considered unnecessary: do not occupy under any circumstance. Earth was the first and most permanent entry on that list. In time, fragments of the Karen perspective emerged too. Interrogation transcripts from late war prisoners and post-collapse archive thefts from the ruined ascendancy told their own side of the horror, and they made the story worse. Human historians reading those documents found, to their surprise, not a simple tale of alien barbarity, but the inward collapse of an army that had lost the ability to trust world, map, or command. Karen soldiers wrote of endless ground that refused obedience, of civilians who looked weak until nightfall, of weather that arrived like planned artillery, of roads turning on them, of forests making noise in the wrong language, of being shot at from church towers, fishing boats, orchards, museum roofs, drainage canals, ski lifts, metro tunnels, and old ruined castles no one had thought still tactically relevant. One field officer, writing to a mate he would never see again, described Earth as a place where every civilian object dreams of becoming a weapon if you stay long enough. Another summarized the war in a line later circulated in human special operations circles with savage appreciation: the planet did not resist us. It absorbed us. That, more than the casualty total, may have been the most accurate epitaph. On the 50th anniversary of the final Karen collapse, representatives from dozens of worlds gathered at the largest memorial field in southern Patagonia, where the last organized invasion command had died between Blackstone cliffs and the sea. The memorial itself was austere by human standards, not a triumphal fortress, not a giant soldier, but a long descending path lined with names of human dead and, farther inward, a separate sealed wall bearing only the number of Karen who had fallen without individual inscription. Some visitors criticized that wall for being too merciful to invaders. Others argued it was exactly right. The dead enemy had earned no romance, but neither had they earned the erasure their own empire once tried to impose. The world had ended them. Let the record say so. During the ceremony, an old veteran from the early mountain campaigns, white-haired, one-leg mechanical, voice still iron under the years, was asked by an off-world journalist whether the famous phrase remained true in spirit or only in statistics. He looked out over the sea for a long moment before answering. "It's true in the way that matters," he said. "They came here as conquerors. None left that way." And that, finally, was what the galaxy learned from Earth. 1 million alien soldiers had landed. Not one returned. Not because humans were invincible. Not because the planet was magically protected. Not because the invaders had lacked strength. They had lost because they mistook civilization for softness, diversity for weakness, memory for sentiment, and one difficult world for a prize instead of a system older, meaner, and more adaptive than their doctrine could survive. They landed expecting a campaign. Earth gave them a grave.